All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we're talking about whether or not the Falcons can pull off a second upset in a row this weekend against the Dallas Cowboys. We'll talk about DMPs breaking down why Steven Means gets so much playing time, as well as answering a couple of your listener questions.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong, however, on Twitter at FalcFans, putting up weekly content over at the Falcoholic, the SB Nation website for the Atlanta Falcons, and also the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by McDonald's, proudly serving communities since 1965. McDonald's has always been more than just a place to get tasty, affordable food. It's an unofficial community center. We give a big thank you to McDonald's for always being there. I'm loving it. So, guys, before we get into today's episode, where we talk about the Falcons' potential to pull off a second upset in a row this weekend against Dallas Cowboys and some of the concerns I'm looking at entering this game, we'll be talking a little bit about Dean Pease's Thursday press conference, in which he talked about why Steven Means. He was asked directly why Steven Means gets as much reps. He answered that question. I know that's been a big concern to a lot of Falcon fans. Why does Steven Means continue to get all these reps despite a lack of production? And we'll get into that. And I think that also his answer to that probably also applies to some of the questions and concerns that a lot of people have in terms of why, insert young other player on defense does not get a lot of playing times thus far this season. So we'll get into that on today's episode, as well as answer a couple of listener questions, including Julio Jones being an afterthought in the Tennessee Titans offense and why that is. We'll get into concerns about Matt Ryan's arm strength, as well as what is sort of the catalyst behind why the Falcons offense and Matt Ryan specifically is generating more of those game-winning drives this year than he was in most recent years under Dan Quinn, and those game-winning drives that we know Matt Ryan has been known for throughout his career, particularly early in his career. So we'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But before we get there, guys, I want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify, as well as now on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube. Make sure you leave a comment, hit that like button, and all that jazz. So let's jump into the sort of question entering this Falcons Week 10 matchup against Dallas, and it's really a question of, can the Falcons pull off two upsets in a row? Last week, they were able to overcome the New Orleans Saints, who were favored by 6.5 points in that game. This week, the Cowboys are favored by 9 points in this game, and this is a big question about this current regime. And in the past, where it came to the Falcons getting a big win, an unexpected win, the very next week, they had a tendency to give you a little bit more of a letdown, at least in the latter 2 or 3 years of the Dan Quinn era. And obviously the question is going to be, is that going to change now with Arthur Smith taking over this team? And, this year represents a learning opportunity about this new regime. That's really the big concern for this team, not necessarily competing for the postseason, although they're in playoff contention. And it's funny because 2 weeks ago, when I had Josh Kendall on the podcast from The Athletic, and we talked about the Falcons playoff possibility, a number of folks, at least in the YouTube comments, expressed their disapproval of that subject matter. And now that the Falcons are, at least technically, the front runners for the 7 seed at this point in the season 2 weeks later, I'm of a mindset of like, okay, let's pump the brakes on that. And part of that is due to, I think we need to see what this team does in the second half of the season, right? If you go back to my initial season projections of where I thought this team's record would be, I had them finishing 8-9 this year. But despite the fact that they're 4-4, that's like not a big surprise to me, because I think at this point in the season, I had them going 5-3. I think I had them beating Philadelphia in Carolina, in addition to Miami in both New York teams. And obviously, they weren't able to beat either Philadelphia or Carolina, but they did beat New Orleans. I did have them beating New Orleans in Week 18, but not in Week 9. I think I also had them beating Jacksonville and Detroit as well. So those were sort of, I think, the 8 wins I expected from this team. And to me, the question is going to be, I still look at this team as probably, as I explained to Josh on that episode a couple of weeks ago, I still see this team as probably like a 7 or 8 win team, which I don't think is going to be good enough to make the postseason. But, it's certainly a team that can be in the conversation come December, which is not been the situation for the Falcons for many, many years. So that is a positive thing for that. But I do wonder whether or not, if this team is going to be a serious playoff contender, then wins, they kind of have to, I don't want to say this Dallas game is a must win, but they're going to have to start beating some NFC teams if they're going to potentially hope to win a tiebreaker, right? So, beating up on New England next week or whatever the case may be, and Jacksonville later in the season, certainly will certainly help their record. But if we get into a tiebreaker situation, that's not going to really do a whole lot to move the needle. So this week is a big week for the Falcons, and I'm curious to see if they can pull it off. When you go back and you look at that upset against New Orleans, hindsight kind of tells you, it's like, well, is it that surprising that the Falcons upset the Saints, given that the Saints were dealing with a third-string quarterback? They had some injuries up front. They don't really have much weapons to speak of. And basically for the Falcons defense, it was, if they can stop the run, they can be able to slow down the Saints offense, given all those other concerns. But, they were able to do that due to, the ascension of Anthony Rush, who we will continue to hype on this podcast until there is a day where we don't need to hype him on this podcast. But I don't foresee that day happening anytime soon. But you look at the real question for that Falcons team hitting in that Saints game was whether or not the Falcons offense could score points against a pretty good Saints defense. And it's a similar conversation this week against Dallas, although I don't think Dallas presents as unfavorable a number of matchups against this Falcons offense as New Orleans did. I don't think you have to worry nearly as much about the Falcons losing the battle in the trenches against Dallas as you did against New Orleans, especially now that Randy Gregory is going to be missed this game and be out for several weeks. And he was Dallas's primary pass rush guy. In New Orleans, we know that, they had multiple guys like Cameron Jordan, Marcus Davenport, and David Onyemata historically have given the Falcons a ton of problems up front. And so I don't know if Dallas really has that. And so you also were worried about the Falcons offense going up against that Saints secondary, particularly because the Falcons' number one weapon in Kyle Pitts was going to be matched up against Marshawn Lattimore. And Marshawn Lattimore has a history of taking players like Kyle Pitts, looking at you, Mike Evans, out of games. And for the most part in this game, outside of, a handful of plays, was pretty effective at doing that in that Saints game. But fortunately for the Falcons offense, the other playmakers stepped up. We know that Cordero Patterson is capable of stepping up, but we hadn't really seen it, since that Washington game. And he did step up in a major way. We also saw big plays and key plays from Olamide Zaccheaus and Russell Gage. And you wonder if that will continue this week against Dallas. But I think the fortunate thing for the Falcons is that it may not have to continue, because Kyle Pitts should have another big game, because I don't think Dallas is going to have as much success keeping him in check as New Orleans did, as Carolina did, because I don't think there's a Stephon Gilmore or Marshawn Lattimore on Dallas's defense that can go toe-to-toe with Kyle Pitts. And so we'll just sort of have to see how that works out. Although we know that in games where teams have deployed a lot more zone coverage, Kyle Pitts has not been as effective in those games as he has been in going up against man coverage this season. It's not to say he's been shut down in those games, but we'll see what Dallas does, because Dallas tends to play a little bit more man coverage than most teams, not as much as Miami, not as much as New England. But they're right neck and neck behind those two teams in terms of the usage of man coverage in the back end. And so we'll see what Dallas decides to deploy. Do they go man heavy against Kyle Pitts? That's asking for trouble. And then what do the other playmakers do? So to me, that's going to be the big concern this week. Can the Falcons keep pace with Dallas's offense? Because I have absolutely no expectations that the Falcons defense is going to slow down Dallas's offense all that much. I know Dallas had a hiccup last week against Denver, but I think a lot of that, at least the narrative that I'm going with in my head is because Denver's got superb corners, and while AJ Terrell is as good as it gets, as much as I defend Fabian Moreau on this podcast, I don't think he's much of a match for some of those other weapons. And we talked about this on yesterday's Thursday crossover with Marcus Mosher. If CeeDee Lamb's going to play a lot more in the slot due to Michael Gallup's return, that's going to be a major problem for the Falcons moving forward, because Eric Harris, Richie Grant, and Avery Williams just, to me, are not going to cut it going up against CeeDee Lamb. So that's going to be a concern for the Falcons defense. So we'll see if the Falcons offense can keep pace. I'm expecting, if I'm going to put a final score on it, I'm thinking it's going to be like a 34-27, 34-30 win for Dallas this week. So we'll see how that goes. And, we'll see if the Falcons can get some stops in the fourth quarter in this week. I was looking up the stats to sort of look at Dallas's ability to start fast versus Atlanta's ability to start fast. And Dallas is up there in terms of first quarter points. We know the Falcons are at the bottom of the league. Dallas, I think, is fourth in terms of first quarter points scored. And the Falcons are like 27th in first quarter points scored. But Dallas is also very high up there in giving up a bunch of points in the first quarter. I think they're the sixth highest in terms of points allowed in the first quarter. And so this may be the week that Atlanta gets off to the fast start that has been missing all year long, going up against this Dallas defense. But, in doing that research, the thing that jumped out to me is Falcons, in terms of points allowed, are actually like sixth lowest, I think, in points allowed in the first quarter. And like in the top 12 to 15 or so in the second and third quarters, but the fourth quarter's been abysmal for their defense. They've given up the most points in the league, and some of that is owed to the 2 pick sixes in that Tampa Bay game. But even if you were to remove those from the data set, they would still be dead last in the league. So it's one of those things where the Falcons' fourth quarter it just all comes unraveling for them in the fourth quarter, and so they're going to have a lead. You would imagine going to the fourth quarter if they're going to have much of a chance to beating Dallas. But speaking of fourth quarters, we'll get into a conversation and answering a listener question about Matt Ryan and the Falcons' propensity to get more fourth quarter comebacks and game-winning drives in that fourth quarter later in the episode. But before we get into that, I do want to touch upon Dean Pease's comments in his Thursday press conference about why Stephen Means continues to get a lot of work. And I think it's applicable to some of the other young players that we are here. Many people are consistently complaining about not getting enough playing time. And we'll get into that conversation as we move forward on today's Locked On Falcons episode. But before we get there, guys, I want to let you know that today's Locked On Falcons is brought to you by McDonald's, proudly serving communities since 1965 with tasty, affordable food. When I'm heading to McDonald's, I'm on a mission to get fries and McNuggets, but you may be on a mission, if you're a student and heading to your study group, to get that dependable Wi-Fi along with those fries and McNuggets. And you might be on a mission to head to McDonald's to refuel and recharge after the game, whether you're part of the home team or the away team, or you were just watching the game in the crowd. And of course, McDonald's is there for you on those long road trips for you to rest your legs and refuel. McDonald's is there for me, and it can be there for you as a place to refuel and reconnect. And it's a place with that dependable Wi-Fi. So next time you head over to McDonald's, why don't you go check out the Locked On Falcons podcast with that dependable Wi-Fi. McDonald's, I'm loving it. So we, often on these Friday episodes, these last couple of weeks, we've been reacting to, whatever interesting things Dean Pease says on his Thursday press conference. Always entertaining watch, always informative. You'll learn something, right? And today was no different. And, a reporter asked him, why does Stephen Means get so much run? What is it about Stephen Means that leads to him playing a lot? And basically, Dean Pease's response was, he knows what to do. He's dependable. He's trustworthy. He plays 100 miles per hour. He's in the right spot, and he'll do the right thing. And basically ended it by saying, I love guys that you can just trust, right? And, that's interesting because a lot of people over the last month in particular have been complaining about how much playing time Stephen Means has gotten this season. And, that's essentially Dean Pease giving you the answer. He's dependable and you trust him. He knows the scheme. And I think you can use that not only when we have the conversation of why a player maybe like Jacob Tuioti-Mariner, the Falcons just released and got picked up by the Steelers on Thursday, why the Falcons decided to let go of him. Maybe he was a player that didn't know what to do. And I think this also potentially applies to other young players across the defense that I habitually hear and see people complaining about why isn't this guy getting playing time, whether that's Mykal Walker at the linebacker position, whether that's Darren Hall or Richie Grant in the secondary. So it's one of those things where, it does seem like you can imply, and Dean Pease isn't explicitly saying this, but the implications are that certain guys are playing because they know what to do. They're trustworthy. They're dependable. And coaches like having guys that they know what they're going to do. They know, it's a tough way to put it in terms of it's like the lesser of two evils, but like it's like you want to dance with the devil that you know rather than the devil that you don't. I guess you could put it that way. And so, it's interesting to me, and I think people are more than welcome to have a difference of opinion with Dean Pease, but I think the thing you have to do in this situation is at least hear Dean Pease's perspective and understand that perspective. And you're more than welcome to disagree with it, but you should at least acknowledge, like, I understand that perspective. And I think you should also acknowledge the fact that, whether you're looking at Stephen Means or any other veteran players' reliability or dependability or whatever the case may be, a lot of it is, if you're looking at the production from some of these guys, particularly Stephen Means in comparison to some of these other edge rushers that have been asked to play a lot in the absence of Dante Fowler these last couple of weeks. I'm looking at you, Ade Ogundeji, primarily. Stephen Means is producing, right? And so if you already have that confidence in the player to do his job, and then you double that, you couple that with the fact that he's out producing other players, and in this case, you look at Stephen Means, you look at how many pressures guys have had in the 3 games since Dante Fowler's been out with an injury. Obviously, Grady Jarrett's leading the team with 10 pressures, but guess who's second on that list? It's Stephen Means with 4, all right? And no other edge rusher has more than 2. Brandon Copeland has, I think, 1. I think James Vaughters has 1, according to Pro Football Focus. If you listen to Wednesday's episode, I also gave credit for James Vaughters with another hurry in that game in my charting. But, Ade Ogundeji in 3 games has been held without a single pressure. And, this is not meant to pick on Ade Ogundeji, but when you're sitting here talking about, I don't understand why Stephen Means continues to get opportunities, you can also, why isn't anybody saying the same thing about Ade Ogundeji? Right? Why is Ade Ogundeji getting more snaps than Stephen Means is these last 3 weeks, which he has been, and if you're talking about, okay, James Vaughters, making that big play against the Saints, that game-changing play against the Saints, and you're wondering, okay, who's he going to replace? I don't think the conversation is really about him replacing Stephen Means as much as I think a lot of fans would like it to be. It's really about, should he be replacing, eating into Ade Ogundeji snaps? Because again, if push comes to shove, if the proof is in the pudding, all the adages is I can't say that word. All the adages. All right. If the proof is in the pudding, Stephen Means deserves more opportunities, regardless of his dependability, based off of his production these last couple of weeks in Ade Ogundeji. So, me pointing this out is not to simply, I often find myself defending unpopular players. You go back to last year when I was very early in that season defending Isaiah Oliver when everybody else was killing him. I was a trendsetter in that regard. And then you look at this year with players like Caleb McGarry or Fabian Moreau and now Stephen Means. I have a habitual, I'm a patron saint of lost causes or whatever. But it's one of those things where, like, it's not because I think these players are good. It's just like, I think they're fine. And I think they often get a worse rap than they deserve. Like, people, for some reason, want to focus all, like Jordan Richards was another example of a player, 3 years ago, where it's like, for some reason, like, these players become these lightning rods for criticism amongst fans and I don't quite understand why people go so hard against players that are just, they're fine. You know what I'm saying? And like, ignore other players, like everybody's complaining about Caleb McGarry. Meanwhile, like, Jalen Mayfield's the worst guard in the NFL, right? Like, at least he's graded out as the worst guard in the NFL. So it's like, why is all the focus and attention on upgrading Caleb McGarry when, and that's just sort of how I feel like with Steven Means. It's like, look, I don't think Steven Means is playing great football, but like he's playing better football than Ade Ogundeji. So why are we spending every single week complaining about Steven Means' playing time and no one's sitting here complaining about Ade Ogundeji? And that's not meant to knock Ade, but it's just like, I know why it is, particularly in those two examples, because it's rookies and people always give rookies the benefit of the doubt, even though when they shouldn't give them the benefit of the doubt. But I just think it was an interesting perspective that Dean Pease was expressing there. And I think more people need to hear him rather than just simply dismissing him because it happens to disagree with their own opinion, and just at least understand what perspective he's coming from in that regard. So on that note, we'll leave that aside and get into the Q&A portion of wrapping up today's podcast, talking about, Julio Jones. I know he's a lightning rod of a conversation, not as much today as he was, 4 or 5 months ago. But we'll get into why he is not putting up numbers in Tennessee to the same degree as I think a lot of people expected, myself included. We'll get into a conversation about Matt Ryan and concerns about his arm strength and whether or not, my criticisms earlier in the season about a weakening arm are valid, today, as well as looking at, his propensity to get fourth quarter comebacks. He's got 3 game-winning drives this season, which is, I think, matching what he had in his total last 3 years combined under Dan Quinn. So what is sort of the catalyst behind that? And we'll get into all of that on today's Locked On Falcons. But before we do, I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen. Of course, it's free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, but I always have recommendations for what you should listen to as your second listen of the day. And of course, got to plug the local shows here on the Locked On Podcast Network, whether that's Locked On Hawks, Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Braves, and Locked On Bulldogs. If you're looking for another show to watch on YouTube, make sure you go subscribe to those. And of course, Locked On Hawks, like those other shows, are free and available on a variety of audio podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify. So I know for you guys that are local to the Atlanta area, you often are dealing with being in that bumper to bumper traffic and wondering, how much gas you're using up, how much money you're spending on that gas, and looking for ways to save at the pump. And now you can with a new app called Get Upside. Get Upside is a free app that when you open an account, you get 25 cents back per gallon every time you fill up. And over time, that kind of savings can add up, with some people making as much as $200 to $300 a month in cash back with Get Upside. And of course, you have multiple cash out options. You can get direct payments into your bank account. You can get it PayPal. You can get it put into gift cards for retailers like Amazon and more all the time. And when you open an account with Get Upside now and use our special promo code Touchdown, you'll get a bonus 25 cents back per gallon. So that's up to 50 cents back per gallon on your first fill up. So don't pay full price at the pump anymore. Download the free Get Upside app, available in the App Store or on Google Play, and use that promo code Touchdown when you sign up. That's Get Upside, promo code Touchdown, to start saving every time you fill up. So we get into the Q&A portion of today's episode, and our first question comes from Jim C. He asks, I would like you to share your thoughts on Julio Jones with the Titans. He repeatedly appears on the injury report as limited participation / questionable, leading to a game decision. I watched him carefully against the Rams on Sunday. It appeared he was rarely in the progression, as A.J. Brown was the main go-to guy. I compared his game stats for Sunday: 4 catches, 35 yards on 4 targets, with our receivers against the Saints. Patterson, Gage, Pitts, and Zaccheaus had more yards, and all but Zaccheaus had more targets. For the season, Julio's 21 receptions for 336 yards pales in comparison to Kyle Pitts' 36 receptions and 546 yards. Has Julio become an afterthought for the Titans? Thanks again for the terrific podcast. Thank you for that, Jim. I think it basically boils down. A lot of it is due to the fact that Tennessee does not throw the ball nearly as much as the Falcons do. So you kind of have to base it off of how many times they throw the football. Right. And essentially what has happened with Julio Jones, and I think it's fair to say that he has been an afterthought, at least relative to what we have known Julio Jones to be for the previous decade, which was this high volume number 1 top end wide receiver. And he's basically producing like a typical number 2 receiver now in Tennessee, playing opposite A.J. Brown. When you look at the 5 games that he and A.J. Brown have played together, in those games, Julio has been targeted 27 times, while A.J. Brown has been targeted 46 times. Now, when you look at the number of attempts that Ryan Tannehill has had in those games, 158, that means that Brown is getting about 29% of the targets, which is a high end number one, and Julio's getting about 17%, right, which is a typical number two. And you compare that to a relatively similar offense, um, going back to 2017 with the Falcons, for the sake of comparison, with Julio as the number one and Sanu as the number two. And we're not talking about years where Gabriel and Ridley were eating into a significant part of Sanu's targets there to muddle the playing field. So during that 2017 season, Julio got about 28.5% of the targets, so right around AJ Brown's 29% this year. And Sanu that year got 19% of the targets, which was a little bit more than Julio's 17% this year. So, without really watching the film, I can't necessarily speak on the exact mechanism that has caused Julio to become this afterthought, as you put it. But I think it's fair to say that Julio is being treated like a typical number two in terms of his workload in targets. But the thing that you can say about Julio is that he is making more out of what limited targets he is having, particularly when you compare him to a player like Sanu, because Julio is generating a lot more explosive plays. That's evidenced by the fact that Julio's averaging 10.8 yards per target, which, compared to some of those years he had in Atlanta, would be the third highest mark of his entire NFL career. And you compare that to Sanu's yards per target mark in 2017, which was 7.3. And Sanu's highest mark in his NFL career was the following year in 2018 with 8.9. So essentially, Julio has gone from being this high volume number one wide receiver to basically a secondary number two playmaker, right? That's what he is essentially asked to do. And he's done a pretty decent job of that. But certainly when you compare him to just the volume of targets, particularly from other players here in Atlanta, he's going to pale in comparison there. So our last two questions come from Josh W. He asked, his first one is, a couple of times in the last few weeks, you mentioned Matt Ryan's weakening arm strength. Other than a few underthrows earlier in the season, it seems like he's getting more dialed in. I haven't noticed much. What things do you see that make you think his arm is getting weaker? And the second question is, early in Matt Ryan's career, he was incredibly successful at game-winning drives under Dan Quinn. That seemed to go away. Why has it come back? And what are they doing differently now than under Dan Quinn? So, for the sake of clarity, this question was sent in by Josh right after the Dolphins game, and that's my bad for not answering it until now. But you're right. At that time was the sort of the beginning of the end of the underthrown passes for Matt Ryan. I can't think of an instance of the last couple of weeks where Matt Ryan has underthrown a pass. I go back to the London game in when he underthrew Pitts really badly in that Jets game on that deep ball late in that game. But since then, I can't recall any instances where Matt Ryan has underthrown the ball. So I agree with you. He has been dialed in, and it is a concern that was an issue for the first 4 or 5 games of the season, but has not been a concern for the last 3 games. So, it seemed like for those first 4 or 5 games, at least from my perspective, it seemed like when the Falcons rarely went deep during that stretch of games. But it seemed like every time he went deep and did make a good throw, there were like 2 or more underthrown passes. And that was a concern, because when you extrapolate that over the course of an entire season, where you're maybe expecting a quarterback to, throw the ball 50 times downfield, 50 plus deep balls, if 30 plus of those are underthrown passes, you're probably not going to be able to maximize your potential to generate explosive plays. And you got to remember, that's kind of the goal here with Matt Ryan's final years here in Atlanta. And, we know that the plan is that, for Matt Ryan to play an indeterminate at this point in time number of seasons. And, for the sake of argument, let's say 3 more seasons, with the idea of using that time period to build up the rest of the roster and then probably make the switch to a new quarterback, similar to what the Chiefs did when they, built up their roster under Alex Smith and then made the trade to get Patrick Mahomes, right? And so the question is, how do you maximize Matt Ryan over these next 3 or so years? And the concern is that if Matt Ryan's arm strength is considerably weaker, it sort of shortens your timeline, right? Where when you're at the point where, you're hoping that Matt Ryan has 3 more good years left in him, or 2 or 3 more good years left in him, if he has a considerably weaker arm, that shortens the timeline to maybe he only has 1 or 2 good years left in him. And then at that point in time, you may have to make the switch prematurely before you've built up the rest of the roster. And that is certainly a concern for you moving forward. So, I don't know, um, you know, where Matt Ryan's arm strength is. I don't think it's as strong as it used to be, but let's say it's 10% weaker than it used to be, and used to be 5 years ago, 7 years ago, whatever the case may be. At what point the question is, at what point is there a threshold for it's going to be a certain weakness where it becomes a bigger problem? And from my perspective, it seemed like we were heading in that direction based off of the first month of the season, but he seems like he's, as you said, dialed in these last couple of weeks, and maybe he just needed a couple of weeks to get some practice in that he didn't get in August due to not playing the preseason. No, I'm never going to let it go. But if he's 10% weaker now, what's that threshold? Is it 20% weaker? Is it 25%, 30? I don't know. That's certainly debatable, but at some point it's probably going to reach that point. The question is, at what point is it going to be? Is it going to be a year from now? Is it going to be 3 years from now? Is it going to be 5 years from now? At some point, you're probably going to reach that point where Matt Ryan is going to be, quote unquote, washed. But I don't think we're at that point right now in the first couple of games, because he didn't particularly play well in the first 3 weeks. It looked like he was washed, but again, 3 weeks, man, that's weird. That's a weird number that it took Matt Ryan 3 weeks to figure out. It's almost as if he just needed 3 weeks in an earlier part of the season, maybe what would you call it? A before season, an anti-season, preseason, maybe? I don't know. But anyway, maybe he just needed some time to get his feet wet, or whatever the case may be. Your second question, I'm sure it's a lot of factors, in terms of trying to focus on one specific one. I have no idea, but I'm sure some of it's owed to the offense being a little bit better this year, or at least theoretically being better this year than it was the previous years. Although there's evidence to suggest that it isn't better, but some of it's probably owed to the defense being good or bad, right? And this is not just comparing this year to previous years, but just like generally speaking, throughout Matt Ryan's career, when he's had good defenses, there has been a tendency, it's not sort of a strong correlation, but there has been a tendency, particularly early on in Matt Ryan's career, where the Falcons generally had above average to good defenses those first 5 years under Mike Smith, that he had a lot of game-winning drives and fourth quarter comebacks and whatnot. And we haven't really seen that as much in the years since. So that probably has something to do with it. But, what's interesting about the whole Matt Ryan with the game-winning drive stuff, and again, I haven't done enough research to really say one way or the other, but it's just something that I think about, is I remember going back several years ago where someone was doing some research on this. And, one of the things that stood out to me in that research was when they looked at Matt Ryan's propensity to get these game-winning drives and fourth quarter comebacks, almost all of them came at the end where the Falcons needed a field goal rather than a touchdown. And I remember the other piece of information that stood out in that person's research, and this is probably like 7 or 8 years ago, but was that Aaron Rodgers does not have that many sort of clutch performances, if you want to call them that, which was surprising because at that time, Aaron Rodgers was still widely considered to be the best quarterback in the league. And so that was one of the things that stood out. The other thing that has stood out over the years in looking at the past is that, most of Matt Ryan's game-winning drives come in games where the Falcons blew a lead, right? Where the Falcons either had a lead at halftime or had a lead at the end of the third quarter, and then blew it at some point in the second half, and then put together the drive, often resulting in a field goal, to go down the field late in the game, and at some point in the final, 8 minutes of the game or whatever, to go out there and win the game. And maybe some of that is why we didn't see as many in the last 3 years, in particular with Dan Quinn. You saw a decent amount in the first 3 years of Dan Quinn Sr. I think they had like 9 in his first 3 years, which is not as much as they had with Mike Smith, but certainly was not a small, insignificant number of game-winning drives over that 3-year span when the Falcons were, good. We often forget that the Falcons were actually generally good, and from 2015 to 2017 under Dan Quinn. But, part of me wonders if, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah. Part of me wonders if, that has something to do with it, where part of the reason why the Falcons haven't had as many, the last couple of years is that they are, not in as many situations where they're holding leads at halftime or holding leads in the third quarter. They're playing far too often from behind. And I know that was certainly the situation last year, where it just seemed like, it seemed like every single week in the second quarter, like the other opposing team would just blow the doors off of them and they would fall behind. And so that probably is contributing to it. Some of it, again, going back to that whole point about scoring field goals instead of touchdowns, some of it may be due to the fact that the Falcons, generally speaking, do not have, or at least Matt Ryan does not have that many game-winning drives, last I checked, where the Falcons had to go down the field and score, 7 points, 6 points, or whatever the case may be, than it is when they had to score 1, 2, or 3 points. And maybe that's a part of it, where more and more these last couple of years, they've needed to go down the field and get 7, and they haven't been as successful doing that throughout Matt Ryan's career. But that's only been, exposed, I guess you could say, these last couple of seasons as well. So I haven't done enough research to really give you a definitive answer, but those are just some of the theories, the hypotheses that I have that may explain why that is. I don't know if it's just simply like, well, the team is better coached or whatever, the easy narrative where it's like, well, the culture's changed or whatever. I don't know. I tend to have a hard time buying into those. So I'm sure there's a multitude of mechanisms that contribute to why it seems like the game-winning drive tap has been turned back on in comparison to recent years. And so those are some of the theories I have. But that's where we're going to leave it, guys, here on today's Locked On Falcons. And before we duck out of here, I want to plug another show that you should check out for your second listen of the day, particularly if you're invested in making a little bit of moolah on not only football, but other sports. That is, of course, the Locked On Bets podcast, where handicapping expert Lee Sterling is going to give you his daily picks each and every day to help you make a little bit of extra money. And maybe that includes, picking the Falcons to win this weekend. So check out Locked On Bets, free and available on a variety of podcast platforms. And with that being said, we'll be back Sunday with a rapid reaction here, not only on YouTube, but on the various audio platforms, Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify, sometime Sunday afternoon/evening after the Falcons Cowboys game. So definitely check that out, and we'll just sort of see what happens on Sunday and see if the Falcons can, do the unthinkable and have 2 surprising wins in a row. It's been a long time since, this team has been capable of that, and we'll see if this new regime is capable of getting that out of this team, and suddenly, maybe then I'll be a little bit more willing to buy that whole idea of maybe the reason why we're getting more game-winning drives from Matt Ryan is, the culture or whatever the case may be. So we'll see what happens on Sunday if the Falcons can pull off the upset and beat Dallas. If you want to send in questions for future Q&As or any type of feedback that you want to provide me, of course, you can leave a comment here on YouTube. You can hit me up on Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons, or you can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. I appreciate it, guys. Till then.